Hello and welcome to our weekly share on the Parsha with the commentary of the Al Shulchan Kodesh. I'd like to dedicate this week's share. Those who were with me last week when we were talking about dreams, this is Dreams Part 2, I mentioned that it was a little bit late going out, in fact, a couple of days late going out, because I should have been getting on a plane on my way to my new grandson's bris in England, but unfortunately, I was not allowed on the plane. That was a whole story I explained last week. However, I just attended virtually the bris of my new grandson, who is called Reuven Dov ben Eliyahu Eliezer. So I want to wish myself, my wife, my children, particularly his father and mother, Eliezer and Suri, nachas on the birth of my newest grandson, Reuven Dov, was named after my late brother-in-law, Alav Shalom, who passed away just over a year ago. It's a wonderful simcha. So if you would like to dedicate a share to celebrate simcha for a new child, or to commemorate somebody who's passed away, or any other good Jewish reason, please just, as usual, contact me at yy@rabbiyyy.com, and we will do exactly that. So, if you remember last week, Yosef is in prison. There's the famous story of the Sar Hamashkim and the Sar Oifim, and the distress on the faces of the Sar Hamashkim and the Sar Oifim are because nobody can interpret the dream. But as we explained last week, the word poiser means indeed to interpret it, but it really means to tell us what the dream says is going to happen. And Yosef's response to that is the besorim, the carrying out of what the dream predicts is going to happen, is in the hands of God. But if you tell me what the dream is, I'll be able to tell you what it means. But whether that comes true or not, that utterly depends on whether Hashem wants it to come true or not. And if you recall from last week, we talked about the fact that if a prophet, that's the highest level. Remember, a dream is only a 60th of prophecy, but a pure and complete prophetic message, and fully qualified, as it were, a prophet who says something bad's going to happen, it may only happen. If he says something good's going to happen, it must happen. Bad, it might happen, because Hashem could find all sorts of reasons for making sure that it doesn't happen. Hashem, determines whether the outcome of the dream, the outcome predicted by the dream, is actually going to become a reality or not. So that's what Yosef is saying. The outcome of the dream coming true, that depends on God. But me, I can tell you what it means, but whether that will actually turn out, that's in the hands of God. So that's where more or less we left off. We had, of course, lots more to say, and you can see that in the share. But I'd like to take up the end of last week's parsha, leading into this week's parsha, because of course, we've got more dreams, only this time it's the dreams of Paro. And here is what, let's focus on this bit. It's from last week. I said they're completely joined at the hip, these two parshas. So it says, the Yisapar Sar Hamashkim is Kolom of Yosef, and the Sar Hamashkim, the wine minister, would be the minister in charge of wine production. He says to Yosef, in my dream, that Yisapar Sar Hamashkim es Kolom. And the Sar Hamashkim tells his dream, and he says to him, in my dream. What does that say? Seems to be two things. It says, the Yisapar Sar Hamashkim, the wine butler, we'll call him that, which is what most people call him, says his dream to Yosef. Right? He says it. And then it says, in my dream, I saw a grapevine with 3 tendrils, and etc., etc. And we all are aware of what he actually said, and he takes them and he squishes them with a cup of Pharaoh, etc. Now, there's something extremely interesting here, and I've got to read you the Alsha, because this takes us into deeper territory about exactly the provenance of dreams and what exactly they mean. Listen to this. So he says, when he doesn't say, in my dream, this is what I dreamt. But he's already said he told his dream to Yosef. And he said, in my dream, Sar Hamashkim es Chaloma, he told his dream? And I said, in my dream. 2 tellings of the dream. So the question is, why did it say the second bit? He's already said he told the dream, so why is it repeated? But not only that, only elements of or part of the dream actually predicted the fate of this man who had the dream. The bit about the three tendrils of grape, what's that got to do with anything? I mean, the message is that I took the grapes and I squeezed them into the cup of Pharaoh and I gave it back to him. Interpretation, you're going to get your job back, right? You'll be restored to your office. That's the message he wants to hear. The rest of the dream, that they started to bud, and then the grapes blossomed, and then there's three. What's that? So he says something incredibly interesting. So let me read to you this again. But the fact that it says that on the vine the flowers budded and then grew into the grapes. That's nothing to do with what was the final outcome of his fate, getting his job back. Became Becholam Sarah Oifim, this exact same story with the baker. Because when Yosef says that the birds eat from the topmost basket of bread, that's nothing to do with the dream. The dream, first of all, he said it was only one basket of bread, but Yosef says in the utmost basket. So there's parts of the dream which, as it were, address their fate, but other parts of the dream that don't address their fate. And that leads us in to the interesting idea of Yosef putting his trust in the Sarah Mashkim, which seems to result in him being in prison for a further 2 years. But we'll come to that shortly. From this we can understand what the Medrash says when they say Kol hadroshas asher pisra b'chaloma elo hakol al in Yisrael. The Medrash says that the rest of the dream was not about him, the Sarah Mashkim, or him, the Sarah Oifim. This is what he told to Yosef. It was what was going to happen to Yisrael. So I have here the Medrash Rabbah with me, beside me, I should say. Which I just nearly dropped on the floor, but incredibly managed to stop it dropping on the floor. So here is what the Medrash Rabbah says. So the Medrash Rabbah here says, this is Medrash Rabbah Peches, and it's Medrash Hey, the Yisapar Sarah Mashkim. So it starts off with the Sarah Mashkim tells his dream. Behine Gefen Lafonai, and he says that I had this cluster of grapes in front of me. El Yisrael is referring to the Jewish people. That part is not referring to him; it's referring to a dream, a very 60th prophecy, an insight what was going to be happening in the future, but not up to him, but to the Jewish people. In other words, the duality going on here. There is an aspect to the dream that does predict what his fate would be, but also in telling it to Yosef, telling him what the fate of the Jewish people is going to be. They give the Shloshas Rigim and the three tendrils from which the grapes would grow, and the grapes is therefore a metaphor for the Jewish people. The three tendrils from which the grapes grew was, interesting, Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. Aha. Okay, but he kaparachas, and they start to bud. The budding, starting to blossom. That's the beginning of the redemption of the Jewish people. It's a prediction of what's going to happen as a consequence of Yosef being in Egypt. It's a connection to the story. It's an insight into what's happening now. Tremendously interesting. And this leads us into some really very fundamental understandings about how dreams work, etc., and how prophecy. Remember, we're going with the idea that a dream is a 60th of prophecy. So it's a taste, a miniature, a microcosm of a prophecy. So let's consider the following question. We've now established, and maybe I'll read that post-it to you again, and with that insight, it'll now make perfect sense, because we said there's two tellings of the dreams. Yes, because there's two bits to the dream that he is aware, or he feels. That word feel is going to be important for us in a second, that he feels, the Sarah Mashkim feels, two elements of the dream, one which addresses me and one which I can't make head or tail of. But Yosef knows, standing in front of me, that I understand that the message is for me. So therefore, again, the Pasuk says, Yitzapa Sarah Mashkim es Chalomon. So he tells his dream to Joseph. It's his dream. But Yoma Eloi, B'chalomi hine gefen lefonai. But in the dream, there was a gefen lefonai. There was grapes in front of me. Now, that is predictive for him, but it's also predictive for the Jewish people. There were two tellings, because there's two aspects of the dream, two insights, two interpretations of the dream that are going to be told to Yosef, and Yosef is going to understand. One that addresses this man in front of me, and one which addresses me and the Jewish people. That's really what's going on here. Good. So therefore, with that established, the question really is, if it's a message for Yosef, and it's a 60th of prophecy, and it's a message for Yosef to understand that really the fate of what's going to occur to the Jewish people is going to be a Moshe, and Aaron, and Miriam, enslavement in Egypt, eventually an Exodus. Why not give him the dream? Or why, I suppose, if we're talking really a microcosm of prophecy, why give one prophet an insight if it's for somebody else? Why not give somebody else the insight, particularly if they're a prophet? Now, for that, we have to turn to the Rambam. And the Rambam says, and this you'll find in it's called the part of the Rambam's famous Mishnah Torah, and it's in the section called Yochas Yesodi HaTorah, and we are going to be looking at, it's very easy to remember this, chapter 7:7. Chapter 7 and Halacha 7, 77. So he starts off by saying, here the previous part is telling us about the exactly how prophecy works and how a person becomes a prophet or prophetess. But in Halacha Zayin, it says a very interesting insight. It's possible that the message that the prophet gets, or in our case, the glimpse into the future that we discussed in last week's shir, that will be something which is specifically for him or for her. And why? Laharbas lo liboy lahisiv datai achioda mashalo machoyot ma'asim medvoram. It might be that the prophecy with the message only for the prophet or prophetess is a specific message for them, either to tell them what's going to happen to them in their life or to give them insights and understanding that they never had before, to broaden their perception. So it can be part of their process of attachment to God, in other words, only in a much broader, much deeper way. So it could be a personal message for one of the two reasons we just outlined. Or it could be or it could be there's a message he has to convey to other people. Or means it might be a message for him to convey to a city, a king, rulers, so they'll change their behavior and the threat of the predicted negative future won't come true, which is something we discussed, of course, last time. So therefore, it's possible, says the Rambam, that the dream can be specifically for the prophet, or rather, sorry, the prophecy can be for the prophet. Translate that in microcosm to the dream is for the person, or to convey to others. So therefore, again, our question is, why didn't Yosef get the dream? Why not convey the message directly to him? And the answer is really quite simple, I suppose, which leads us into the next aspect of this, Yosef's additional 2 years in prison, because in telling the dream to the Sarah Mashkim, who conveys the dream to Yosef, there's also built into the fabric of that the ability for Yosef to seem to make the mistake to rely on this human being to get him out of prison instead of relying on God, which lands him in jail for another 2 years. So in not giving it directly, then he's in coming through somebody else, there is the opening up of Yosef to make a mistake, which will extend his prison sentence. That would not, of course, occur if he gets the message directly. There's nobody else to turn to. He's not getting out of prison. It's them going to get out of prison. So therefore, he asks them to be the emissary to get him out of jail because his sentence is up. We'll come to that shortly. So the inbuilt, therefore, there is an ability through this for Moshe, for Yosef, keep saying Moshe, for Yosef to slip up. Now the Alshach, I'm going to skip to the Alshach, and then I want to tell you what Rabbi Dessler has to say in this, and this is tremendously important. And this Rabbi Dessler is going to be in Chelik Beis, which I have ready here. But let me read to you what the Alshach has to say on Yosef slipping up, right? When he says, now let me read the pasuk. You know what? I always have my art scroll here because then I get to argue with them. So let's hear what he has to say in this. This is Mem and Yud Daled, and he said the following thing. So he said, "Ki im zachartani itcho." So he says the following thing. I'll read to you what the English says here. If only you will think of me with yourself when he benefits you. So remember me, itcho, when you're doing well, remember me. Kasher yetiv loch, because I've done you a favor. Imodi chesed, and do me a kindness, and remember me or remind me to Paro. In other words, I'm unjustly in prison. Get me out of here. Two expressions in which he asks or seems to ask this man to solve his problem. For that, the classic position is he was given another 2 years in prison. He should not have been depending on another man. So listen to what a human being to save him. In fact, as we know, King David, and when he comments on this, says, happy is the person who puts his trust in God, and extremely unhappy is the human being who puts his trust in human beings. Human beings are remarkably unreliable, whereas God is completely reliable. Now, if you're going to say, but there's times when I davened and God didn't answer my prayer, the classic Jewish position, which we don't have time to expand on in this particular share, is that, or I'll give you a quick story. One of my friends, whose daughter, a little girl, I think 9 or 10, was in an elementary school, and one of her classmates' mother has got cancer, and all the little girls prayed like crazy and did all sorts of good stuff, all sorts of mitzvahs in order for the mother to get better, but she didn't get better and she passed away. And the little girl was devastated and said to her daddy, I don't understand. We asked Hashem and he didn't answer our prayers. He said, he did answer your prayers. The answer was no. But the no is gamza l'toiva from a Jewish point of view, even though it doesn't come out. It doesn't mean to say God didn't listen, but it might be for a greater good that we can't perceive of, and maybe even a greater good which lasts or will only come to fruition generations later. You will see exactly why that part of the puzzle of human history had to play out exactly as it did. Anyway, but basically, let me read to you what the Alshich says here. We're talking about Yosef Tzaddik, and Yosef is indeed called a Tzaddik, and he reaches an incredible spiritual level as a consequence of being a Tzaddik. How could we imagine for a second that he would put his trust in a human being? I don't know about you, and I don't want to sound too jaundiced, but one of the worst things you can do is do a big favor to somebody. And what that means is, of course, often people resent you if you've helped them, particularly when we're extremely vulnerable, because every time they see you after they've recovered their situation, even if it's through your help, but you're a constant reminder of when they were vulnerable and when they couldn't do anything except with your help. You're a constant reminder, therefore, of their frailty and vulnerability, and nobody likes to feel vulnerable or frail, and you become the picture that triggers that reaction. So therefore, sometimes in doing somebody a favor, all you're going to do is get back a slap in the face, as they say. If you've dealt with people, that will be an inevitable experience you will have at least once and maybe many times. So he says, come on, so Nesha, she also talk about Moshe Adam. So I, Yehuda Rubinstein, you need an electron microscope to see my spiritual level compared to Yosef Tzaddik, then if I know that, why didn't he know that? Why did he ask for help? Well, the answer is, of course he knew that. But, so let's, to answer that, look where it says another medrash, when the medrash says that for these two expressions of remember me and get me out of here, then that indicates he was given another 2 years in prison. Why does the Medrash say it's because he used these two expressions, remind me to para and remember me, that got him the other 2 years in prison? How about just the overall general idea that he seems to put his trust in another human being? That should surely be enough. When he says that you're going to get your job back, that was all right until he said these two expressions. Not that he thought that this man would lie in the hands of this man. Oh, I should at this point interject and say you're not supposed to rely on a miracle. You're supposed to do some hishtadlus, but in the basic effort that is necessary so that the thing should seem to work in natural ways. And what would be more natural than asking somebody to help you whom you have helped? But despite that fact, it gives the appearance, even though it's not true, Yosef did not trust this man. He was just, as it were, checking the box that he has to check, that in order to not be relying on a miracle, but it gives that appearance. But more than that, the Al Shukazan say from the other medrash we looked at, when the parts of the dream predict things for him and the Jewish people, then he certainly feels it's his moment to act. Carpe diem, grab the moment. The blossoming, the budding of the vine, and the vine is the Jewish people, he feels refers to me. This is the moment for me to start blossoming. My time is up being in prison. I should get out now. Now's the time to act. But we still have to address in more depth this idea of him being in prison for a further 2 years. And with that, we're going to turn to Rabbi Dessler and see what he has to say. And this is a very deep thing. It should be a sheer in its own right. But to cut a very deep idea into small segments or just headlines, it comes out like this. The more you put in to your avodah, you making it yours, your connection, you're connecting yourself to God, the more siyata d'shmaya you get. When God gives you something for free, it's always devalued. Its value is lessened if you got it free, but if you gain it yourself, if you earn it yourself, it's got permanence. It has permanence. That's the headline, and we've got a lot more to say in that. But when Yosef had said it, well, I'll read this bit of Rabbi Dessler for those who want to see it in Rabbi Dessler. Then you will find this in Mitzvah Miliach base, page 231. So he says that this, the story of Yosef at this stage is very amazing, he says. When the end of the story comes about and he reveals himself to his brothers, he says, I'm Yosef, your brother, whom you sold me to Egypt. That was very dramatic. And the Shuv Omar, then he continues and says, Al te'otzvu, don't be upset with yourselves, but Al yicher b'nechem, don't be angry about this. Ki b'chatam oisi yena, ki l'mechia sholchane elokim lefnechem. Because God sent me here in order to change Egyptian society so that the Jewish people would not be destroyed by it. And we know that Yosef did change certain fundamentals of Egyptian society. But in the first part of the pasuk seems to say, you sold me here. The second pasuk says, God put me here. So which is it? God sent me here. And made me to be the second in command for the entirety of the Egyptian empire. So he says, this is now on page 232. The fact that you sent me here in order to be the person who could act to keep you alive by giving you grain, etc., that indeed was the consequence of you selling me here in the first place. But to get me to promoted to such a level that I'm now the number 2 to Pharaoh, that was God's doing. So you didn't do that. The law has it doesn't mention it in that bit, the fact that you sold me at all. By Tamnira, and it says that Rabbi Dessler, the reason is, because to become the king in Egypt, that was ultimately a gift from God. It's something beyond what a human being could have accomplished or could have achieved. And that is the free gift you get from heaven. Every free gift you get from heaven is cheapened relative to you or your worth or your having earned it, because you didn't earn it, it was free. And obviously, by him being made the king of Egypt, that was a tremendous thing which lessened the effects of the exile on the Jewish people. But that came at a time where, in Joseph's story, where he couldn't see God. In fact, you could easily have echoed or even predicted the words of King David, who said, Keli, Keli, lama azavtani. My God, why have you abandoned me? He didn't commit adultery with the woman who tried to seduce him. He didn't, he was thrown in jail. He's he could have had, as so many people have when they go through bad times, complaints against God's behavior of him. O b'shas hast upon him ein nosnim etonim arusad le'el. El im kein toktem asrusad atos dahaina zachias mitzada odom. He says that it required Yosef to generate something which was absolutely amazing. And that was to have no complaints, even though he could say, my name is dirt throughout Egypt because I passed the test and you threw me here. Keli, Keli, lama azavtani. My God, why have you abandoned me? But Yosef at no point had any complaints against God, even after the extra 2 years. And that incredible devotion to God and pushing away any complaints he could have had against God, that is something which truly earned him the ability to have earned the role of king of Egypt, and consequently to be able, through the pain that he's gone through, which he pushes away, that leads him to be worthy of being the king of Egypt and saving the Jewish people. But therefore, that the irony of having passed all those tests and ending up like this, that's part of the test. That's part of the test that creates the great man Yosef, who on a spiritual level is able to draw down all sorts of siyata d'shmaya, heavenly intervention to help him change Egyptian society so it doesn't destroy the Jewish people. But that had to come from him. And that he has to come to him when he's really pushed to the limits, having not committed adultery with a woman, having put on trial on false charge, and been found guilty, but he's not guilty, and now he's put in prison another 2 years and still no complaint. Let me quickly tell you a story. When I was going to England in the summer, actually got in on that particular occasion to see my children and grandchildren whom I hadn't seen for 2 years. When I was going there, just before I left, there's a certain rabbi in London who sent me a voice message. And I was, as you can imagine, traveling at that time was very difficult, well, as it is now. And so the message said, "Hello, Rabbi, my name is such and such, fellow in London, and we're making a movie, and we want you to contribute to this movie." And I was so busy, I'll get to that later, not in the moment. And then the next week, when I was in England, the message came again. And this time I gave it my attention. So the message was that we're going to be making a film. And the film was about, there's a famous story, apparently a true story, about a young Jewish fellow who bumped into an old Jewish man and who explained that he used to be a religious Jew, but God has taken away everything. He took away his son in the Holocaust. This fellow's a Holocaust survivor. He's finished with God. He's angry with God. And the young fellow said whatever he said to him, but that's how the story goes. It apparently, in Yom Kippur, which was only a few days later, at a break during the service, out came the young fellow for a breath of air. And there was the old fellow sitting on the wall outside the synagogue. I assume they were sitting there, as they say in Hebrew, bedafka, particularly to demonstrate that he wasn't coming in. So the young fellow went over and reintroduced himself and recalled himself to this fellow and said, "Why don't you come into the synagogue?" And then he went into his whole spiel again about how many complaints he's got against God. And anyway, so eventually, this is how the story goes. He persuades him to come in and say, "Look, don't come in to pray. I understand that, but we've got a chazan. There's a chazan. He's the most beautiful voice in the world. Come in just to listen to him for a few minutes. It'll be beautiful for you to hear." And they somehow persuades the fellow to come in, and he's standing there listening to the chazan who's got his talus over his head, and then he suddenly starts to shake and cry, and he walks to the front of the bima to look up. Now he can see the fellow's face, and it was the son he thought he'd lost in Auschwitz. He had survived. And that must have been quite a moment. The question the rabbi who was making the movie was, what would you, me and other rabbis, what would you have said to that fellow to get him into show? And I looked at that when I listened to that, I thought, gosh, that's interesting. And then suddenly the idea came into my mind that I would have said to him, why don't you come in for a moment and just see if you can actually bring yourself to forgive God? Because the human condition is, how could you have done that to me? You're so cruel. See if you can forgive God. It would be a trick I think might work in order if had been there just to get him in, go in to tell, no, I can't forgive you, and give him a piece of your mind. And then, of course, he would have seen his son. But the point is that we do have this reaction when God seems to let us down so badly, and we're finished with it. Yosef was let down pretty badly. And time after time after time. But he didn't have any complaints against God. As a consequence, not have any complaints against God, he earns a spiritual level which allows him to be the architect of the restructuring of Egypt. We all know he moved the populations from one city to another city, made men do bris milah and various other things, and never in any way interfering with the priests, the priestly caste of Egypt. So there was tradition: you leave priests get respect. So they left our Leviim alone, from which Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam would come from. That all came about because he earned it by going through terribly tough times without complaint against God. That comes about, therefore, only because he's going to be put in prison for another 2 years as a consequence of his interaction with the Sarah Mashkim and the Sarah Ophim. It's a dream that one person has, a microcosm of prophecy, to be told to another. It could have been told directly, but then that other essential element would be absent from it, which would have gained him the ultimate accolade of being someone who accepted fully, no matter how tough things were, what God had in store for him. And then only later could, as it were, the happy ending be revealed. That's another interesting aspect of what a dream might be when you dream for somebody else. But we're going to come back to that shortly, because I'd like to now move on to next week's Sedra, or this week's Sedra, sorry, I should say, because that was last week's Sedra. And let's consider, might as well look at my art scroll, because I've got it right here, and let's see what they have to do. I've already obviously prepared this, and I've already got a little mark here saying I disagree with their translation, or rather the Alshich does. But let me just read to you, and we all know this story. Let's read and see what it says. Vahimikate Shunasayim Shonim, and it was from the end of 2 years of days, of Paracholim, and Paro is dreaming. Vahine Oimed Aliyar, and he's standing on a river. Now, there's a whole, I think everybody knows this story. There's a story of the 7 fat cows coming up from the river, being swallowed up by 7 thin, dreadfully thin cows, 7 fat ears of corn being eaten up by 7 sick and disease-looking ears of corn. And the critical thing here in Posach Ches, that he tells the two dreams, he tells to his dream interpreters. Now, bear in mind that the Egyptians had incredible powers, incredible mystical powers. They could see the future. They see there's going to be a boy born who's going to grow up to be the man called Moses, who's going to save the Jewish people. They see that they are correct. They had incredible occult power, and yet they are not able to interpret this dream. And Rashi says that, well, let me read to the Rashi, let me just finish the Posach Ches. It was in the morning, he's upset, he calls for all the magicians of Egypt, and all the wise men of Egypt, and he tells him his dream. But nobody can tell, give a poiser, a prediction from the dreams what's going to happen. But the rabbis, including Rashi here, says "Ve'in poiser oisam" should be the end of the sentence, and nobody can interpret it. But he says nobody can interpret it, the Paro, and Rashi says to Paro's satisfaction, though they did interpret it, but it didn't satisfy Paro. Now here's another very critical insight into dreams. So we're going to look again at Rabbi Desta and the Alshich here. But let's start with Rashi, the commentator par excellence, and he says, oh, they could interpret the dream, okay. But not to the satisfaction of Paro, because their voice didn't enter his ears, we would say enter his heart. It did not sit well with him. And they were not able to do what they say, what would go into his heart. Oh, the 7 cows, you're going to have 7 daughters. If you're going to 7 daughters are going to die. You're going to You're going to conquer 7 cities and you'll lose 7 cities. Why not? And more than that, I can't resist throwing in here. I can't remember where I had this idea before. There's another incredibly interesting idea. And that is, but why couldn't they interpret this? This is easy. This is 101 dream interpretation. 7 fat cows, healthy cows eaten by 7 thin cows, 7 fat ears of corn eaten up by 7 diseased ears of corn. What could that possibly mean? Let me think. Famine? Yes, famine. Yes, okay, you can graduate from the first day to the second day of 101 kindergarten dream interpretation school. It's so obvious. Why couldn't they interpret it? Well, somebody said very brilliant. It's because they were able to look into the future, as I mentioned before. They couldn't interpret it because the dreams, to anybody with half a brain, would obviously be screaming that there's going to be a famine. But because they could look into the future, they looked, and what did they see? No famine. Healthy, happy people walking about, because of course Yosef was going to be able to restructure Egyptian society in such a way that the famine was not disastrous. In fact, there was plenty of food left through Yosef. Interesting. But this idea of not being able to sit with Paro takes us into another incredibly critical idea of dreams. However, I do want to read you what the Alshich has to say here, because he asks several questions. And the first one is well, it's not in the chronological order, but he's certainly going to argue about how the ArtScroll translates this. Here's the ArtScroll. It happened at the end of 2 years to the day. Okay. Pharaoh was dreaming that, behold, Pharaoh was dreaming. Okay, you know what? That's not bad. It's really, they're just making it good English. I'm not actually arguing with them now that I think about it. They've got it right. It's just that it's not was, he is dreaming. Opara cholem is in the present tense. So after 2 years of days. So the Alshich says like this. Why does it say mikates from the end of 2 years of days? When does it say 2 years? And mikates from the end, or from the ending. And he is dreaming. So let me read to you what the Alshich says here, because this is very, very interesting. And then we'll go on to Paro's inability to accept the interpretation of the dreams, which seems reasonable to me. So he says the following thing. Let me find this. The rabbis say, he says, the Medrash says, and this is what we talked about before, and that's why these two parshas are joined. He says, the extra 2 years in prison that he got was because of what he said to the Sarah Mashkim when he says, two expressions of remind me to Pharaoh. Remember me when he's good to you, and remind me to Pharaoh. But Rolos and Lev, and it says the Alshich, that's very nice the Medrash says that. And where did they get it from? Where does the Medrash see an indication that that's exactly what it meant? The days of his incarceration were up. How did he know that? Maybe the 12 years he was in prison, he was meant to be in prison for 12 years. So what does it mean? The assumption is that when these two expressions got him another 2 years in prison, and then he gets out and he speaks to Pharaoh. No, maybe it was 12 years he was meant to be in prison, and not 10 years. So where did he get that from? Where did they get the idea? It was an extra 2 years. The Medrash says the following thing, or the authors of the Medrash understood. Now, it's a little bit tricky. I'm trying to think how to say this, and go back in time to the accusation or the framing of Yosef when Ashes Potiphar tries to get him to commit adultery. Now, at that point, the phrase is 10 drops came from his finger, and she in other words, there was a loss of his seed, 10 drops. She grabbed him, and there was 10 drops of seed that were lost at that point. For each drop of seed, a year of being in prison was the consequence of that. I suppose what it really means is Yosef should have run away a second earlier so that couldn't have happened. Because as the Medrash says, he nearly gave in. So he should have run away earlier, so that shouldn't have happened. Okay, or couldn't have happened. So that, and he was therefore in prison for 10 years, as we said. So let's do the arithmetic here. He was 17 years of age when he goes out from prison. Okay. And he would spend a year in his master's house. Takes him to 18. And he was 30 when he came in front of his master. Right? So that takes us to 12 years. So therefore, we can see quite clearly by just doing some simple arithmetic here that he was in prison for 12 years. And the 2 years before that, he said to the Saramashkim, get me out of here. My time's up. But he says, no, get me out of here. It's not please, it's no. Get me out now. My time is up. And because he then said that, that gets him an extra 2 years in prison. That's how they come to the conclusion the extra 2 years were because of these two expressions. Although, as we've just explained previously, it's actually the appearance of what these two expressions suggested to other people seeing the story. Of course, he didn't believe that this man would get him out of prison. He knew it was going to come from Hashem. He simply thought he had to do this hishtadlis, go through the motions, check those boxes, and then he would be gone. Prison, as were previously explained. Okay, so now we know why he's another 2 years in prison. But then why is Paro unwilling to accept the interpretation of his dream interpretation? Now, for this, we have to look at Rabbi Dessler elsewhere. This is Rabbi Dessler in the fourth Chelik of Mitzvah Eliyahu, and it's in page 166, and he says something which is tremendously, tremendously interesting. And there is a warning here. You have to be very careful who you tell dreams to. So there's a story in the Gemara, and I remember I told you last week that the Gemara ran about Nun and Vov, page after page, on dreams and how they work. The Gemara there says, Kol achar peh. If a dream comes true, it comes true according to the interpretation put on it by the person you've taken the dream to ask for an explanation of what it's predicting. And the Gemara says an incredibly interesting story about Abaye and Rava. And Abaye and Rava, two of the Talmud's most famous rabbis, often had the exact same dream. And they would both take it to a fellow called Barhedia, who was somebody who interpreted dreams. But the interesting thing is that for one, he interpreted the dream, exact same dream, favorably. And for the other, he interpreted the exact same dream in a devastating way, in a negative way. And astonishingly, both came out exactly as it was predicted to. But it turned out that one had given him money. One gave money to him, and one didn't. For the one who didn't get money, he got a bad interpretation of the dream. For the one who gave him, didn't give money, bad interpretation. The one who gave money got a good interpretation. I assume they didn't know that we're both going to the same fellow, or you could easily have joined the dots, and I suppose they could have both given them money. But anyway, the point is, and the Rabbi Dessler asked this, but this makes no sense. How can the fact you gave money to the fellow change the outcome of the dream? If they both have identical dreams, and this is not just a one-off, but it was a whole series of dreams that they both identically dreamt, and yet when they bring it to this fellow, one gives money, and he interprets the dream, and it comes out favorably because he got money. But why does money change the interpretation of the dream? The dream, if it's predictive, and it's the same dream, it's the same prediction for both. No. And here's an interesting Rabbi Dessler. And this applies to us when it comes to dreams as well. So let me read this a little bit to you because I think it's very important. Okay, where's a good place to start? Okay, he says, when it comes to having somebody interpret your dreams, as Paro asks, or as the Mashkim Sarah Ophim turned to Yosef, and certainly Pharaoh turns to his dream interpreters, listen to this. If you ask somebody to interpret your dream, And he interprets it in one particular way. And if the person having the interpretation, if he hears it and it fits, it sort of clicks with him. The Yiddish word is ticked. It's ticked. It's sort of like, yeah, because that's an expression. Sorry, b'dibur. That in the interpretation that fits with you, it makes the dream come true because it fits with you. Oh, missed that bit out. That means that ultimately you interpret your own dreams. When the Sar Hamashkim gives the dream to Yosef and he interprets it, and it makes sense, it makes sense. And interestingly, incidentally, by the way, that both Sar Hamashkim and Sar Oifim are really, and Rabbi Dessa says this, really upset, sorry, the Alshich says this, really upset not because there's nobody to interpret the dream, but we don't know if the dream is good or bad. The Gemara says this in Bava Basra, much worse than bad news is waiting for bad news or anticipating the possibility of bad news. Back to this. Now, it comes out as follows, that when Paro hears the interpretation of the dream, it just doesn't fit. Because really, you know who you are deep down in your subconscious. You know who you are. And if a dream says, go back to Abaya and Rova, the two rabbis from Gemara, when one heard that the dream was interpreted, and this fellow who interpreted the dream was a phony. It turns out eventually he was a fraud, as so many are. But because it fitted with his even subconscious view of himself, if he interpreted that something bad deserves to happen to you as a consequence of this dream, what he really meant was he didn't give me any money, but that fitted with the rabbi hearing that, or us hearing it. Yeah, I do deserve that. Because you know yourself at the subconscious level. Then you accept it and you make it come true for yourself. That you become ultimately your own dream interpreter. Let me read that to you from Rabbi Desters. So it comes out that the version that you hear, if you think, yeah, that's fair enough, I do deserve. So it says you're going to fall and break your leg. Yeah, I do deserve to fall and break my leg. You're really paskening, you're really interpreting and predicting your own dream. Because the truth is, because when Paro rejects the interpretation of the dreams of his ministers or his mystics and magicians, they didn't come true. He didn't lose 7 daughters. He didn't lose 7 cities. But when Yosef predicts, then that does come true. It makes sense to him. And perhaps that relates to the fact that when we're in our mother's wombs, we're shown from one end of the world to the other end of the world, which we've discussed before. And that doesn't mean to say, as the world is a ball or as a circle, it has no beginning or no end. What does it mean? It means from one end of the world, the beginning, to the other end, the finish of the world. You're shown the whole of time. So we're shown the whole of human history, and we forget it when we're born, but it's somehow a residue is in our minds. So when Paro hears and the dream fits, he feels that his people deserve 7 years of famine. He feels that he deserves 7 years of famine, and he sees, as it were, that could easily be right. Then it fits. You have to be careful about who you take a dream interpreter to. A dream for interpretation to. It can bring back the bad report as well. It's precisely at the moment after 2 years of days, 2 years of days, not 2 years, 2 years to the millisecond. After the 2 years are added from Yosef, saying to the Sar Hamashkim, remember me and remember me, that when those 2 days are up to the second, that's when Hashem sends along a dream to Pharaoh, a dream that's going to cause Yosef to get out of prison. The man who overcame all of the natural human reactions of anger and resentment, that God, why could you do this to me? You've taken away everything and I've done so much for you. The man who overcame all of that generated tremendous salute from heaven to become the captain that sailed the Jewish ship into the stormy seas of 210 years of the exile in Egypt, but in a course that would eventually see them out again. Point two, share two on dreams. We might come back to dreams later on, but I think that'll do us for beginnings for these two parshas. I wish you all a wonderful Shabbos. And again, to my family who may be watching this, Mazel Tov from the birth of our new fabulous young family member, Ruth and Dov.